Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this episode of Trade Winds, where we'll talk about trade in the Asia Pacific, notably the CPTPP and IPEF, and I will explain those acronyms shortly. My name is Cecilia Malmström. I'm a non-resident fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, DC. And I have three wonderful guests with me here today. Wendy Cutler, who is the Vice President and Managing Director of the Asia Society Policy Institute and a former acting Deputy US Trade Representative. We have Eunice Wang, Head of the Asia Pacific Trade and Comprehensive Policy at Google. And you have also spent quite some time at the WTO representation in Singapore in Geneva. And Johan Koo, former Trade Minister of the Republic of Korea, and now a Senior Fellow at Peterson Institute, and my colleague. A warm welcome to all three of you. It's a pleasure and an honor to have three such distinguished guests with so much knowledge about trade. So today we will look a little bit closer at two cooperation frameworks and talk about the differences and the possible overlapping and what they aim to achieve. CPTPP is a trade agreement that stands for Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. It was originally a concept by Chile, New Zealand, Singapore, and Brunei, but it was picked up by President Obama as Trans-Pacific Partnership in order to tighten the trade relations between the US and 12 Pacific Rim countries: Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, and Vietnam. It was supposed to be a trade agreement, but also with a very clear geopolitical objective to reduce dependencies from China and bring countries together with each other and with the US. Negotiations were quite hard, and they were concluded in 2016, but the US never ratified. President Trump withdrew from the agreement as one of his first decisions when he was elected president. The remaining countries made some smaller amendments to the text, and it entered into force as CPTPP on the 13th of December 2018. And the member countries represent more than 13% of global GDP. So this is a good and bad, it's a broad agreement with agreements on tariffs, non-tariff reductions, digital trade, intellectual property protection, services, investment, food safety, etc. And since it's entered into force, many countries have applied for membership. The UK was formally accepted last week. And furthermore, Taiwan, Costa Rica, Uruguay, Ukraine, Ecuador, and ironically, China have formally filed for membership. IPEF, on the other hand, is an economic framework with the US and with 13 other countries. It's partly overlapping with CPTPP partners, but is also broader. Australia, Fiji, Brunei, Indonesia, Japan, India, South Korea, Malaysia, New Zealand, Philippines, Singapore, Vietnam, and Thailand are part of it. It was launched in 2022 by President Biden, and negotiations on supply chains were concluded only recently in principle. It is not a trade agreement, as the US administration keeps on repeating. It is an economic initiative with a trade component. And that means that tariff reductions and market access are not on the table. It has 4 pillars collected to connected economy, resilient economy, clean economy, and fair economy. The US business and agri companies have written to the administration to ask for the government to engage in negotiations to remove tariffs and other barriers, and they want to engage in joint standards in a variety of different fields: chemicals, auto, pharma, etc. And other countries have asked for more market exit. But that is not on the table, at least not for now. Maybe that will change. And recently there was this high-level meeting with IPEF with some conclusions, but details were to follow. So what do we have here? Is IPEF something that is the new element of the Biden economics or the Biden trade agenda? Is it only a talking shop, as some claim? Or is it a new innovative way to really look at supply chains and other trade-related matters? And will the US ever join CPTPP? Wendy, you have looked at this and written extensively about both these agreements. What is the US perspective here? What do they hope to achieve?
Mm-hmm. Well, first, thank you so much for inviting me, Cecilia, and it's just my pleasure to share the Zoom stage with Eunice and Hanku, two close colleagues. And I love the international aspect of this webinar because we're literally from all over the world. You know, when I look at IPEF, my view is that one of the core similarities with TPP, when the US initially joined and kind of led that initiative, is the US recognizes it needs to step up its economic engagement in the Indo-Pacific region, not only to help its exporters, but to help shape the rules. And let's be honest, this is the region where it's happening. I mean, 70% of global economic growth is going to come from the Indo-Pacific region this year. And so that's the objective. What has got complicated for Washington is that what does economic engagement mean, and how can we square that with our political constraints? And as a result, the administration, which is following a so-called worker-centered trade policy, was not interested in these traditional trade agreements like CPTPP, which have 30 chapters of binding and enforceable obligations across the board. They were looking for some kind of new template, a new model, which, as you mentioned, Cecilia, includes a trade component, but is much broader than that and kind of takes on kind of these new pressing issues for the region, including supply chains, decarbonization, and taxes. But let's be honest, the jury is still out on whether this new model will work and whether like substantive outcomes will be achieved, which will really be impactful and benefit the region. If you look at the results from the supply chain pillar that were announced just a couple of months ago in Detroit, and caution everyone, we haven't seen the details, as you mentioned, but just based on what the administration was saying, it sounds like a lot of process to me and not enough substance. But again, I look forward to reading the text. And the other thing, and I'll conclude with this note, is that IPEF is not an end to itself. And so for critics of IPEF, my view is this is a first step. And after IPEF is completed, I think that will open the door for further steps to be taken to even further intensify US economic engagement in the region.
Thank you very much. When we'll come back to a lot of the things you said, but Eunice, Singapore is a member of both these initiatives. How do you see them? Are they complementary, overlapping, or are they about two totally different approaches?
Yeah, thanks, Cecilia, and really, really happy to be here with esteemed colleagues. I think the short answer is that they're two very different kind of animals, right? Like what Wendy said, the CPTPP is really a very full traditional FTA covering a whole range of issues, 30 chapters altogether on issues ranging from tariff liberalization for goods trade to government procurement to investment to e-commerce. It's very broad and it's very deep, right? On the other hand, I think IPEF, and I think the US administration has been very careful not to use the word FTA or agreement on this. It's a framework. It's a new way of thinking centered on 4 pillars that Wendy mentioned: trade, supply chains, clean economy, fair economy. But I think it's, like from what we understand of it, it's not just about rules. It's also about cooperative projects. So for example, it's not just about sort of cutting tariffs and there's no market access there, but it's not just about liberalizing your services, sectors, but really, I think what the parties are trying to do is to think about concrete projects where both, sort of the parties can come together and private sector can also contribute. So one example was last September, at the IPEF ministerial, there was an announcement that there would be a skilling initiative for IPEF that's focused on skilling women and girls in the Indo-Pacific region. I think about 14 million women and girls to be skilled within the next 10 years. And you see the participation of, quite a number of private sector companies, including Google, contributing to this effort. So it's not just about rules. I think it's also about concrete projects that sort of countries can get together to implement. Second, I think it's really what Wendy also said, because it's two different kind of animals, very different in terms of legal nature. CPTPP is binding, enforceable, but I think for IPEF it's still unclear because it's so new. It's unclear what the legal architecture really looks like. And third, I would say that actually there's a lot of overlap, right, between the participants. So 7 countries are in both IPEF and CPTPP. But you do see the entrance of new countries like Thailand, Philippines, Korea, India, Fiji in IPEF that I think will be quite interesting to see, because some of these countries have not, Fiji for example, have not really traditionally been in any of these type of frameworks. So it's quite interesting to see the breadth and the scope and range of countries that are involved in IPEF.
Thank you very much. Hanku, from the South Korean perspective, South Korea is of course very much a member of IPEF, and I know that there are discussions about possibly one day joining the CPTPP as well. What's your view on this, and what is South Korea's expectations on both of the frameworks?
Okay. First of all, thank you, Cecilia, for having me here, and it's really great to share this panel with this really distinguished, this expert on trade. Now that I left the government, I will, talk about more from my, personal view and more neutral perspective. I see this CPTPP and IPEF as more complementary. Not just complementary, but I think that we need both, because we need these traditional trade agreements such as CPTPP and RCEP. We still have a lot of non-trading barriers. Even in advanced countries, there are still high tariff in some of the industries, and so we need to continue to expand this free trade and open trade. But also there are, for the last few years, we encounter these new kinds of challenges that global trade environment are facing, the pandemic and supply chain, etc. For example, Korea is one of the countries which really was exposed to this kind of a supply chain shock at least 3 times for the last 4 or 5 years. First, this supply chain, this chemical related export control by Japan, and also November 2021 by China, this urea supply chain crisis caused by China's export restriction, and also because of the Ukraine war. So Korea was at the sort of kind of exposure of this kind of a very serious supply chain shock. But at that time, we realized that although we have many traditional free trade agreements, those are not really designed to deal with this kind of a new supply chain shock. So that's why I think that we need this also kind of IPEF approach. It has a supply chain pillar, and also it has decarbonization pillar, which traditional FTA haven't really dealt with before. So yes, I agree that there are some, although this, for example, this substantial conclusion of the supply chain pillar in IPEF draws, acclaim as well as these critics, but I think the jury is still out there, and it may be too early to determine. But I think depending on how these negotiators and how this government intend to develop this new framework, I think IPEF could be a useful vehicle to deal with this new kind of supply chain shock.
Yes, you have written about this, and also a paper together with Wendy about how the IPEF can be a means of de-risking. Of course, trade is so much a security issue today. With well, we have seen it in Europe with the war in Ukraine, and we have seen it with the dependence that we all have in critical minerals, for instance. And there are talks about decoupling, but more de-risking and securing supply chains. And as you said, all of you, that IPEF is very much about thinking in a new term, away from the traditional one. But how could IPEF work in de-risking the supply chains in your view?
Yes, actually, I had this privilege and also pleasure of co-authoring this paper on strengthening supply chain resilience through this IPEF with Wendy. And we published it in early May. And so I think many these trade experts had wanted to see more details or more substance from the supply chain conclusion of IPEF, but it looks like this negotiator decided to make it, to make this conclusion, sooner than later, and then leave many of the details for implementation. So now I think it became that the implementation and enforcement became much more important. In traditional trade agreement, we really negotiate all the detail, both and nuts, and all the details of rules and tariff cuts, etc. So you just, in the implementation stage, you just follow those the rule agreed already. But in this case, IPEF, I think making rule is the half of the story. I think more significant, concrete deliverable, or this more concrete operationalizing this, for example, cooperation mechanism. Let's say country A was hit with the supply chain shock on material A. It could be by economic coercion, or it could be by natural disaster, or etc. Then how country B, C in IPEF could help each other? I mean, this rulemaking doesn't give us vaccine or nickel or other critical material. So there needs to be more concrete, the mechanism, cooperation mechanism, how country A could help country B, C, D in a time of crisis through this IPEF. So that needs, all this remaining work needs to be done during this implementation, the stage. So that's why I see that in this Busan, this fourth round of negotiation in IPEF, these countries, it looks like they had this seminar focusing on implementation and enforcement. So I think they need to do all these really war game, like the supply chain simulation game. So and Wendy and I had kind of suggested that they need to really go for the sector-specific approach. And no other area is more pressing and timely than this critical mineral and material. So I think that during this implementation stage, which has to start from now on, these countries need to really develop all the details and more concrete mechanism, how this cooperation mechanism could work.
Wendy, do you want to add to this? Is this something where IPEF can really find sort of its unique way of dealing with things, or could this de-risking also be made within the CPTPP?
Mm-hmm. So, it's interesting you asked that question, because one thing about trade agreements in terms of their scope and coverage, over time, the scope and coverage evolved depending on the pressing issues for the region. And you know that better than anyone, Cecilia. Over time, we added issues to free trade agreements to make them more relevant and to make sure that they were addressing the challenges that were facing the trading partners. So whether it be the addition of labor and the environment, or the addition of state-owned enterprises when we negotiated TPP, or even IPR. I don't want to admit that I was around when IPR was headed to the FTAs, but again, they were evolving. And part of me feels that if we had stayed with the traditional trade agreement route in the United States, that we would have probably advocated for adding a chapter on supply chains. And in fact, in a recent Asia Society paper that I co-authored with the former USTR and Trump official, Clete Willems, we do recommend that a supply chain chapter be added to CPTPP. It's interesting because in the early days in TPP, even before supply chains were really sexy, there was a discussion about having a separate standalone supply chain chapter. We ended up not doing that, but I think it just shows that trade negotiators are always thinking about how we could improve these agreements. So I agree with everything Hanku's saying as well, and I view these initiatives as complementary. But for the United States, it's interesting. Our view is for the administration, we should follow the IPEF approach as a new template and at the expense of pursuing traditional trade agreements. In the region, if you look at all our other partners who are in IPEF, they're doing both at the same time, and they view them as complementary, and I think they view the more the merrier. In other words, the more agreements they can enter into, the better, given all the economic opportunities and challenges in the region. For me, I hope at some point the United States, recognizes that it can do both at the same time, but for now we're not there. And just briefly, when it comes to supply chains, look, there's a lot more that can be done. And I give the IPEF negotiators credit because there are 14 diverse members of IPEF, particularly when you look at their economic development and really their technical capacity to do a lot of this stuff. And these are new issues where there's no real template for rules to put on the table. So I think rules and approaches and mechanisms on these other three pillars will evolve over time because, they're kind of new. The trade pillar to me looks like USTR is basically putting forward a subset of FTA issues that they would like to pursue and think are important, with the additional twist, and I think this is quite interesting, of not just leaving labor and environment to their separate chapters, but really trying to integrate labor and sustainability commitments throughout all pillars of IPEF. And I think that's something to watch closely. I hear from some trading partners, they're not so sure they want to do that. But as we saw with the outcomes of the supply chain work announced in May, that one of the three bodies that has been created under the supply chain pillar is a labor advisory committee, which will, according to my understanding, which will provide input on how supply chains are respecting labor practices and labor rights.
Eunice, I'd love to hear your view on this, because as Wendy said, and also Anko alluded to, Singapore is, of course, very much at the center of this. Without trade, Singapore wouldn't be anything. So your country has taken so many initiatives on this. How do you view this? Is this a way of, trying to do whatever is possible for the moment, or is this what friendshoring looks like in practice?
I'm no longer in the Singapore government, but I think,
no,
as
of course
you said,
not.
Yeah, but Singapore is such a hub for trade, right? It is a trading nation. And so the posture has always, the bottom line has always been, we do what we can to pursue trade openness. We do what we can to make sure that, we enhance and boost connectivity, right? So whether this is in the form of an FTA like a CPTPP, whether it's in the form of bespoke digital agreements like the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement that Singapore, Chile, and New Zealand came up with, or IPEF. I think countries in this part of the world are pretty pragmatic. They see no issues with being part of different frameworks and agreements, because I think the rationale here is that trade negotiators always talk about spaghetti bowl, right? Like of agreements and how it's important not to have sort of things tangled up. But I think few people here are of the view that it's better that the bowl is not empty. Better that it's messy and there's spaghetti in the bowl, and be part of the different overlapping structures or frameworks. And then, eventually it will rationalize itself through some type of, maybe in 10 years time, 20 years time, but it all collects somewhere. So I don't think any of the countries here, Singapore included, sees IPEF as terminal. Whatever that happens in November, I think it will just be the first step. And then we'll see how this evolves.
But isn't there a risk that there could be conflicting goals? Because in both of these agreements, and also many of the bilateral that different countries are involved with, both in the Asia Pacific and also the ones that the US have, for instance, with Chorus, with South Korea since quite a long time. I mean, there are increasing demands on issues that are today very much related to trade, such as labor rules, labor standards, environmental standards, some international convention when it comes to child labor, etc. I think both CPTPP and IPEF has this notion of a trade council, a labor council that will look at both supply chains between, but also within the member countries. Are they all aligned, or could there be conflictual problems with this? What's your view?
Yeah, so we have not seen the text of the supply chain pillar, so really not really sure how the labor, sort of, what's it called, council is going to be implemented. But I think Singapore has taken on environmental commitments in the CPTPP, and I think my understanding at least is that IPEF also works off some of that. So I don't see this as going to be conflicting with what Singapore has already committed to. I think it may be tougher for some of the other IPEF countries. In fact, I don't think it's not going to be that much of a problem for Singapore relative to some of the countries that are not in the CPTPP, right? So if you look at the composition as well, Indonesia, Thailand, Fiji, India, they're not in the CPTPP. So I think for many of these countries, actually, they probably are still trying to understand these issues, and I think it will take some time before they formalize their positions, as I understand.
Wanku.
Yeah, Cecilia, you asked about the de-risking. I mean, de-risking is a buzzword these days, and
absolutely.
I think also we are really living in a completely different environment, and now starting from the U.S. and also European Union, I think this industrial policy. I mean, in this trade policy making, we need to take into account this industrial policy that came back. So with a combination of this industrial policy, for example, the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS Act, and this kind of a new economic framework that we talk about, this IPEF. If we combine this, I think that could be also a very attractive package to the countries in Indo-Pacific region. For example, Wendy and I also included this recommendation of having these Indo-Pacific countries to be eligible for this IRA incentive in terms of this critical material, this sourcing. So I think that is really could be one of the ways to make this IPEF really effective, attractive to these countries in the region, but also helping facilitate this de-risking in these critical materials, and also this the clean new technology. For example, Indonesia or Philippines or Vietnam, they have really good resources in these critical minerals, and Australian companies or Korean, Japanese, or US companies, they want to invest in those countries in order to diversify from their heavy dependence on one big country in the region. So by facilitating and incentivizing those co-investment opportunities in the region through IPEF framework, I think that could really help to facilitate the de-risking of this vulnerable supply chain. Some people see this IPEF as anti-China. I don't see it that way. It's not anti-China, but to many countries in the region, for example, out of 13 countries, except for the United States, in the IPEF, 10 countries have China as their #1 trading partner, except for India. And also for India, also their trade portfolio between the US and China is only 0.%. So China is really dominant, the player in the region. So no countries can live without China. So that's a reality. But also to many of those countries, it's a legitimate concern that they are too much dependent on China in terms of demand side as well as supply side. So if this IPEF could more systematically help diversify and de-risk from heavy dependence on one big giant country, I think that is win-win for everybody.
What do you say, Wendy? Would this be on the US mind as well?
I think it's definitely on the US mind because certain IPEF countries have been very vocal about wanting access, to the IRA benefits and to negotiate a critical minerals agreement with the United States. I just echo Hanku's comments because, many of the IPEF countries are still scratching their heads even to this day, 6 months into the negotiation, wondering what are the benefits. And, to the US credit, they're trying to shore up and strengthen capacity building. They've pointed to resources available or to money available, through the US government for certain projects, including climate-related projects. And then they keep pointing to, if you do all this, then you're going to attract more foreign direct investment. And so I think there's truth to all of that. But if you really wanted to give, a real concrete springboard to the enthusiasm of a lot of IPEF partners in this negotiation, I think expanding their access to our critical minerals market and supply chain would be a great way to proceed. With respect to your other question on conflicts between IPEF and CPTPP, my legal answer would be, given that there's 7 countries that are members of both, I'm sure their lawyers would never allow them to agree to an agreement, to 2 different agreements that are asking for different things. And so I don't see as much that there'll be conflicts. There may be some inconsistencies, in which case it will have to be made clear how certain countries are going to implement these agreements. Also, I think it's important that, I'd just like to raise the issue of digital, which I think is interesting, where there may be some problems that could crop up. And this is largely due to my perception that for the United States, at least with respect to a lot of the core obligations we used to seek with respect to digital commitments and trade agreements, are now being questioned. And maybe we're advocating more exceptions to these rules, which could create kind of a new template for digital. And I think that is of great concern to our business community, which over time has seen a digital chapter kind of strengthen and being updated agreement to agreement. If you look at the e-commerce chapter, for example, in the Chorus agreement, it's pretty outdated, and it's been updated through our bilateral agreement with Japan, but also through the USMCA. But I think where there are concerns, not as much on conflict, but on what direction are we going? And are we kind of watering down some of the core obligations we used to seek in agreements? And, that's a debate and conversation that's still going on in the United States.
So it seems like the Singaporeans are the smartest guy here. They're joining everything they can to take maximum benefit.
And not only joining, but taking the initiative.
And taking the initiative as well. I mean,
yeah.
the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement is very much a Singapore initiative together with Chile and New Zealand. I think South Korea is on on the verge of entering it as well.
Yeah, it was concluded.
Has been concluded. Sorry, I'm not updated to the very last, but that's good as well. And will South Korea also join CPTPP in your view, Wanko?
Actually, that was one of our top priority for the last 8 years. I mean, I'm confessing that I've been working on this Korea's accession into CPTPP for the last 8 years, on and off. But unfortunately, we couldn't cross the finishing line at towards the end of this Moon Jae-in administration. But I think CPTPP is really being revitalized. I mean, I think in a sense, China really helped rekindle this attention and interest from many other countries on the CPTPP. So, but I think that this is a good time for Korea to, restart this process of, the joining CPTPP, because I see that CPTPP is not complete as it is in its current form. I mean, they need to expand their membership to be more inclusive and to be more comprehensive. Right now, South Korea is out, and then most of these ASEAN countries, which will be big locomotive for future growth, out of the CPTPP. So how with this conclusion of the UK's first accession into CPTPP, how the CP country could really facilitate and make it more efficient and effective accession process, I think that would be also important task for CPTPP. So I think Korea has been preparing for a long time. So I think Korea is probably the most prepared to join CPT right away. So I hope that to see that happening soon.
And then there's China as well, the elephant in the room. They have applied to join CPTPP. Ironically, what's your view on that, Eunice? Of course, it would add a very strong trade component, but it could also create some problems, especially also when one of the candidates is Taiwan.
Yeah, so I mean, I think both China and Taiwan have applied, right? So that is a tricky, I think, political issue. It certainly is, and beyond these two, right? You have also, Costa Rica and Ecuador and some of these other countries that have also applied.
And Ukraine.
So I mean, I think there's a long list of countries that have applied. I'm not sure how the parties are going to triage this, whether they will let them all start accession working parties at the same time, or sort of do it in sequence of when they applied. It's really quite unclear. I think the biggest issue here probably is how to deal with. I think the line that people have been taking is that if you do want to be part of this agreement, you have to be very sure that you meet the standards of this agreement. Like the UK accession, I think was one example where they made it really clear that the UK had to come in on the terms of the 11, right? Like basically that it's not that the UK could come in and then add things or take things out of the agreement. So my sense is that they were using the UK accession to set certain standards in terms of messaging as well to the countries that are applying to join.
If I could just add, and I think this is, also really important, the TPP countries, particularly if you read the latest statement coming out of their weekend meeting in New Zealand, which talked about accession, but didn't really reveal what's next. They not only talk about being ready to meet the high standards, which is incredibly important, and that's like kind of a driving principle behind accession, but also they talk about a track record of implementing trade commitments. So in other words, it's not just agreeing to the words, but have you indeed, when you look at your past record of living up to your obligations under trade agreements, how has that applicant fared? And so I just put that on the table. I found that interesting. It also seems to me when I read that statement that there is a process going on already with all of the applicants who are being asked to provide information to the CPTPP countries. But let's be honest, there's a difference of views among the different CPTPP countries on accession, particularly with respect to China. I think all the countries kind of want to avoid a showdown on, voting on this. And so as diplomats, they're probably looking for a way to keep these applications alive and moving while trying to figure out how, given all these geopolitical constraints, how to move forward. And I think, the CPTPP countries recognize the minute they start formally talking to China, any prospect for the US joining is probably then shot. And so, that's another consideration they have to take in mind, that they have to keep in mind as they go forward. And I think that's led a number of CPTPP countries, particularly privately, like urging the United States, just show a little interest as a way for us to be able to kind of, keep our discussions going and having the hope that the US may someday rejoin.
Yeah, but will it? I mean, obviously now with also election campaign soon starting, it seems totally impossible that the US could take such a turn. But if some of the candidates, really show interest and ability to join, and if it spreads, taking China out of the picture for the moment, but the other candidates, and if President Biden is re-elected, for instance, would there be a possibility to join? I know you have written extensively about this and what areas would be, where you could start if there is a negotiation. But do you think there is a chance that the US
So I
could join?
agree with your analysis. Nothing's going to happen between now and the election. But in terms of what could happen after that, I never say never. Because whoever thought that NAFTA, which looked like one of the worst trade agreements we ever concluded, was going to be improved and then passed by an unprecedented bipartisan majority in Congress. So one of the purposes of the paper that the Asia Society issued on CPTPP was to show that, like NAFTA, we could put forward proposals that would not only update the agreement, but could also make it easier for us to contemplate joining, recognizing that the other countries would have to agree to this. So by no means did we mean to be heavy-handed here, but what we really tried to do through our paper is to kind of change the conversation and get people to start thinking about CPTPP kind of as an evolving type of agreement. And frankly, and I also noticed this coming out of the ministerial statement, it needs updating. And the two areas that were highlighted in the ministerial statement from this past weekend were environment and digital. So I think there is a recognition among CPTPP members that not only on their agenda is dealing with accession candidates, but also contemplating changes, adjustments, and updates to the agreement.
Yes, Hanku.
Yeah.
Did you want to come in?
Yeah, in the this CPTPP accession process, I also like to emphasize the role of the informal consultation, because I mean, if you look at this the protocol of CPTPP accession protocol, there is no really clear written rule on this the informal consultation, but I think when Korea prepared for this accession, some sort of unwritten norm or practice was that this aspirant country has to engage with all these member countries for informal consultation. And when each and every these countries agree to it, then this aspirant country can submit their formal application. So that was kind of a Korea, when Korea was preparing for this accession, there was sort of a practice or norm that, as I understand. But so in this case, I think this kind of informed consultation could be used as some sort of strategy, the tool for these member countries to really test this political willingness and their seriousness and substantive preparedness of this explorer country. But you don't also want to be perceived as putting like too high the entrance fee. So you need to strike a right balance in between two. But when we look at these crowded the application these days, I hear that some of the countries really haven't completed this informal the consultation process, and that's why there are so many crowded these applications and the field. So I think going forward, the CPTPP countries need to have some clarity on how they want to use this informal consultation, going forward.
That's a very interesting perspective. I was thinking about, yes, Eunice, please.
Oh, no, I just wanted to add one final point about the sessions, right? Because if you look at the WTO accession processes, some of these working parties are started, but there's no progress, or it starts and stops, and some countries take 20 years to accede to the WTO. So even if working parties for all of the applicants are started, it doesn't mean that all of them will be joining at the same time or anytime soon. So just flagging that point.
Yes, and hanging on to what you said on WTO, I was thinking about the multilateral perspective here, and there's also a question from the audience. Is there a way to multilateralize IPEF, as if this is, as it's portrayed by some in the US embassy, if this is a new way to deal with trade-related matters in a broad way, could this be multilateralized? Could it be open to anybody who wants to join if they comply with some conditions? Anyone?
Maybe I can take a stab at this. I think it goes back to what Wendy said about the design of IPEF, right? Which is for as a vehicle, platform for U.S. economic engagement of the Indo-Pacific. So I'm not sure that anybody who wants to join this will get to join this, but I think you can multilateralize the issues. So I mean, if you think about a very similar platform like APEC, where you have ideas that are generated within that platform, and then brought to the WTO in some way, the environmental goods agreement, for example, the ITA, the information technology agreement. I think these are ideas that were piloted, test bedded in APEC, and then brought more broadly to the WTO. So I don't see why IPEF can't be a similar type of forum to test out these issues. As Hanku said and Wendy said, it's things like supply chains, clean economy. These are cross-cutting issues, right? It doesn't fit nicely under any like traditional. It doesn't sit under one chapter in an FTA. So I think thinking about how to bring these new issues then to the WTO would be interesting, and having IPEF as a testing ground for some of this.
Wanko, you wanted to add something?
I think, this multilateralizing, that is a really important point. If you look at this, what's happening right now in the Indo-Pacific, there's an IPEF going on, and in the Atlantic, there's a TTC going on. But if you look at these 10 working groups in TTC and these 4 pillars in IPEF, I mean, it's really kind of similar in a way, and overlapping. So, I mean, is it necessary? I mean, not necessary, but assuming that IPEF could be concluded by end of this year, and then next year they continue to implement, develop further, and then I don't know what the ultimate deliverables of TTC, but isn't there any way that we could converge or
merge?
Converge or do something about this separately, the going on the Atlantic and the Pacific. So I think that is an important point to think about. I'm curious about what the intends to do, but yes.
And also, what would then happen to WTO? Would it become redundant? That's. I think we'll have a specific episode about this. There are lots of questions coming in from the audience. There's one here for Eunice from Jeff Schott from Peterson. Are there hard commitments by governments to finance cooperative projects? You talked about the business sector, or are governments hoping to propel private firms to fund despite lack of binding government obligations? You mentioned Google's projects before.
Yeah, so I think the DFC has approved some funding, if I'm not wrong, 300 million to finance some sustainable infrastructure projects, including those in IPEF countries. So we do know that the US government has set aside some money for these projects. But if the question is, with regard to the private sector, whether the US government has come to the private sector and said, please invest in ABC, the answer is not yet. I think what we've been told is that, they are negotiating this IPEF, and, if countries sign on to things like commitments on anti-corruption, commitments on tax, that would improve the business environment, and therefore it would make it more conducive for private sector to invest. Where the private sector has come in is on skilling. So what I mentioned just now in September, that commitment to skill 14 million women and girls in the region.
But then there would be, if business engages under the terms of IPEF and invested, then the rules on labor treatment in supply chains, had to be clearer, I guess.
Yes, and I mean, I think, speaking for Google, I think the digital rules have to be clear, right? Like we do need certainty on data flows. We do need certainty on non-discrimination. These rules, I think, for businesses are really important, and not just for Google, right? Like if you think about any business these days, whether you're a large business, a small business, you use digital tools, you use cloud services, and these things all involve cross-border data flows. So whether you're in the health sector, manufacturing, it impacts you equally. So I do think that businesses do want to see clarity and certainty in terms of rules with regard to digital as well.
There is actually a question on this. Given the value of digital trade rules in IPEF, would the guests share their views on how nations in Asia are looking at the DPIIE framework for regional digital rules development? Well, I think any of you could answer this, but the DPIIE is in a way intended to set rules also for other countries, and to be the standards, right? That's why you joined, Anku. Oh, not you, but
yes.
The Republic of South Korea joined, of course.
Yeah, actually, yeah. When I was in office, we started this process. Korea's, joining the DPIIE. The reason being is that I think that is based on the CPTPP, but with more kind of flexible, kind of modular approach. So I think it could be more inclusive, and then sort of could be a basis for developing more comprehensive rule. I mean, as Cecilia, you explained at the beginning. I mean, CPTPP started from this P4, right? And then US and other big players, joining, and then it became really, this current form of CPTPP. So I think this DPIIE could be a sort of a digital version of this P4, which providing some basis for this developed as well as developing countries in the region, and then set a kind of springboard to develop into really more more kind of general, more ambitious, the digital trade rule. So I think this is really positive development.
Yeah,
I think the U.S. really
also in the US. No, sorry. Yeah, please.
I think the U.S. really needs to pay more attention to DPIIE. Not only did Korea recently join, but Canada's interested in joining, and China, unlike CPTPP, not only have they expressed an interest, but they are now in accession talks to DPIIE. And so, if indeed the U.S. is not prepared to move forward on the same timeline with respect to digital and IPEF, then I think DEPA, will become kind of the default kind of, rule-making forum in digital. And so I think for the United States, they shouldn't just like say, oh, DEPA's over there in that corner, and not, again, I think we need to be paying attention to it. There's a lot going on in the region, in the digital sphere. Unfortunately, we're still trying to work out our domestic consensus on this issue. And we may never reach that. And as a result, the rest of the world may just move on without us or come up with their own rules because they're not going to be waiting for us. So I think the clock is ticking for the United States on digital. And it would be unfortunate if this is one of the issues that's kind of like put on hold for the future for IPEF. And my sense is that's where it may be going.
There's a lot of different initiatives going here, also from the European Union side, who's striking bilateral digital deals with Singapore, with Japan and others. And at the same time, you have DEPA growing, and then you have the talks, the plurilateral talks going on in the WTO with around 80 countries making progress, but quite slowly. So this is, of course, a risk. You talked about Canada as well, and there's a question from the audience as well. Can Canada join the IPEF, and what would be the rules, the formal rules for joining? Is it if the US invites, or is there a procedure?
Yeah,
or is that still to be worked out?
My understanding, it needs to be worked out. Look, if 14 IPEF countries, they're trying to reach a November deadline. Dealing with accessions now, I think, is just would just be a bridge too far in terms of their workload. But I know the US, at least initially, has been very supportive, but recognize that they need to work with the other IPEF countries to discuss this. But my sense is, stay tuned on accessions. We're not going to see them between now and November. And frankly, I think that's the right choice because, again, there's so much work to be done between now and November. And as someone who's been at the table in many of these negotiations through the years, there's not a lot of time left. And, we're already in July. The next round, my understanding, will be in Thailand in September. There may be another round following that, maybe in Southeast Asia. And then you already get to San Francisco in the APEC meetings, where, at least on the margins of those meetings, IPEF leaders would, announce some type of agreements in most of the pillars. So July to November for some of us seems like a long time. For anyone who's negotiated trade or economic agreements, it's around
the corner.
It's around the corner, exactly.
Absolutely. Wanku, sorry, did you want to comment on this? No. We are approaching the hour, but I just have to ask. Well, probably you, Wendy. Will IPEF survive a Trump victory?
I'm not worried about that at all, because looking at what IPEF is producing, it seems to me it's hard to be against that stuff, right? Like, it's hard to be against a supply chain emergency mechanism for countries to consult in times of supply chain disruptions. What could happen in a new administration is that they come up with their own initiatives, so they put less attention on some of the IPEF agreements and mechanisms, and they don't put the staff and the resources into pursuing it, wanting to come up with, their own new initiative that they've branded and is associated with them. I mean, the one exception could be in the areas of labor in particular. But again, if IPEF is not enforceable, and a lot of these commitments are, general and vague, or at least not legally enforceable, my sense is that a new administration, it's not even worth the effort to cut it off. It's more will be a question of where they put their priorities.
I see that, I hope that IPEF could be a success, because, this is really, the paradigm has changed. The global trading paradigm has shifted, and we need this kind of new approach, right? So I'm positive that the negotiators really work hard, and they will really, conclude this negotiation by November in San Francisco. But I think what will be after that? I think that, as I mentioned repeatedly, in this kind of IPEF, this implementation will become more important. So next year, how they could really, develop further this concrete cooperation mechanism in supply chain or decarbonization or labor environment. So yeah, I think it has to be sort of a continuing and sustainable initiative to make it really a substantive initiative. Look, I mean, the CPTPP and RCEP, it took almost 7-8 years in the making, but they still kind of improving. So I think in this kind of new the template that we haven't really have any precedent before, I think they need to continue to work on even after declaring victory in November in San Francisco.
Thank you. Eunice, any last words on this?
Yeah, I mean, very similar to what Hanku said, I think is the project that will matter the most. And, if there's a clean energy infrastructure project, for example, that, that the private sector is involved in and governments are involved in, I don't see this really shifting from administration to administration. Skilling initiatives, I think, will continue as well. So at the end of the day, how it's implemented, how these projects are really brought to life, I think I hope will survive and across past the line in November.
Thank you so much, Eunice Wang, Hanku Ye, Wendy Cutler. It's been very, very interesting. We definitely need to follow this up. Thank you so much for spending time with us, for sharing your expertise and insights and views. And thanks to all of you who have been watching. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.